When you engage in the rhetoric of dissent, you're appealing to shared values, shared texts, iconic texts, and you are using those same texts to draw a very different conclusion than what had previously been drawn. Hi, my name is Lisa Gring-Pemble, and I'm an associate professor at George Mason University. I'd like to thank Fall for the book for highlighting Your Daughters Will Prophesy, a book I co-wrote with Martha Watson. My interest in this particular project begins with my fascination with words and language. I think words are extraordinary and they have tremendous power. They shape who we are, what we believe, and even how we act. One of my favorite quotes is, "A choice of words is also a choice of worlds." And so as a rhetorical critic, my interest is in studying people and how they use language to affect change in their communities. So when Martha invited me to write a book about 19th century women and how they used language to transform their reality, I had jumped at the opportunity because it combined my love of words with a longstanding interest that I have in the 19th century. I find women in the 19th century to be extraordinary. They managed to accomplish remarkable feats, and they do so at a time when women were constrained to the home and were not able to speak in public. Speaking in public and doing anything in public really was considered unseemly for women. And in fact, the word promiscuous comes as a descriptor for women who dared to speak before a mixed audience or a promiscuous audience of both men and women. So the story of how women who are largely confined to a private sphere at home find one another, mobilize to act, and initiate the reforms that many of us enjoy today is a story worth telling. And we tell one slice of that story in the book. The focus really first is on one of the chief obstacles that women faced. So that was a set of scriptural passages that constrained women and limited their role so that they were in the home, in the house, in the private sphere, relegating everything public to men. And so you had passages like Genesis 3:16, which talked about how women will desire their husband. Their desire shall be for their husband, and their husbands will rule over them. You had passages in Corinthians and in Timothy telling women to be submissive and silent in church. And if they needed to have any of their questions answered, they should seek counsel from their husbands in the privacy of their own home, because it was shameful for women to speak in public. And then you had Ephesians reminding women that even as Christ was head of the church, so too was the man the head of the household. And all of these passages worked together to create what appeared to be a divine mandate for women to remain silent, submissive to their husbands, and not engaged in any of the public affairs of their day. Of course, there are exceptions. The Quakers were known to have women speakers. But by and large, women were really constrained and limited in what they could do in their life. They were mothers, they were wives, they were sisters, they were daughters, and that was the extent of what they could do. These scriptural passages were tremendously powerful. They also influenced what Barbara Welter referred to as the cult of true womanhood. This was a code of social conduct, and Welter argues that women had to adhere to 4 cardinal values, and their worth was judged by how well they adhered to being domestic, submissive, pious, and pure. Women were told that if they could adhere to these values, they would have a fulfilling, joyful life. And they were deluged with magazine articles and speeches and sermons that just reinforced this is what it means to be a true woman: being pious, being pure, being domestic, and being submissive. And now, of course, not all women could adhere to this code of conduct. Women, slaves, women out of economic necessity would have had to work outside of the home and wouldn't have been able to remain in this private domestic sphere. So even as women were constrained and confined to a very limited role in society, there were a number of socio-political undercurrents which caused women to question their roles and to perhaps consider a more expanded role for women. One of those was the Reformation, which occurred centuries earlier, but it opened the door for individuals to interpret the Bible for themselves. Luther's belief that individuals, lay people, could access the Bible and interpret it for themselves, along with the printing press, which made copies of the Bible available in the vernacular and in multiple languages, really eroded the church hierarchy. No longer was the church in charge of interpreting scripture, but individuals could do it themselves. And then you have the American Revolution with the Declaration of Independence and this idea of democracy and equality and liberty. And this democratization of American society also opened doors for women. A third undercurrent would be the Second Great Awakening, which begins at the very tail end of the 1700s, but really at the very beginning of the 1800s. And at this time, denominations are clamoring to recover souls, save souls, and also enlarge their membership. And so they're not so picky about who does the evangelizing. This also opened doors for women because then they could go out and they could reclaim souls, save souls, and bring people into the membership of the denomination. The last undercurrent is really the plight of slaves and the plight of indigenous people. Women who believed themselves to be these pious and pure Christian women who were morally obligated to do something about these affairs and these injustices were caught between that feeling and a societal perception that these were issues that were not something that they should be concerned about. These undercurrents all encouraged women to rethink their role and to think about ways that they could have a more expansive role in society. And what they did was rather ingenious because they turned to scripture. They turned to the very passages that had confined them into a limited role and looked to them as ways to expand their role. So how did they do that? Well, one of the things that they did was they took scriptural passages that people were familiar with, like when Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb. Jarena Lee writes very early on in her autobiography that Mary Magdalene was obviously a preacher. She was the first person to proclaim the risen Lord. A second strategy was to reclaim passages that had been overlooked. So people would have been familiar with the creation story that was commonly discussed, the one where God takes a rib from Adam and forms Eve to be a helpmeet to Adam. That had also been used to keep women in a subservient role. And Lucretia Coffin-Mott says, well, now wait a minute. There's another creation story also in Genesis where God says that he was going to create man in his own image, male and female, he created them. That seemed to put women and men on a more equal playing field. And then the title of our book comes because it was a passage from Joel that so many women used throughout the 19th century. It's, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Here again, women were saying, God is calling women to a more public role. Look at these passages. They justify women's public speaking role. And the third thing that women did is they went and they found examples of women all over the globe who were in positions of authority. But they also looked to the Bible for women who had positions of authority. And so Sarah Grimke cites Deborah, a judge and also a prophet. And then she says, well, there's Huldah and Anna, and they're also prophets. And then look for people like Priscilla and Phoebe, who are co-workers with Paul. So again, citing women who are taking a more active role and using the Bible to challenge what had been a very limited role for women. This strategy is what we call a rhetoric of dissent. And what that means is that you keep one foot in tradition, even as your other foot is straddling and being a little bit more progressive. And what I mean by that is that when you engage in the rhetoric of dissent, you're appealing to shared values, shared texts, iconic texts, and you are using those same texts to draw a very different conclusion than what had previously been drawn. So in the case of women, they are using the Bible, which is commonly read, it's widely known, and people know that the Bible is an authority. And they are using that Bible and using the scripture in that Bible to challenge some of the interpretations that have constrained them to this private role. And instead, they're interpreting some of these passages in ways that open up spaces that enlarge the role that women can have in society. They also did this rhetoric of dissent in a number of different ways. Their dress. So women, for example, would dress in modest clothes, muted tones, little to no jewelry, sometimes with head coverings. And so they would give the appearance of, we are true women, even as they challenged the roles that they had been assigned by speaking in this particular dress. Another strategy that women use that is involved in this sort of rhetoric of dissent is the media that they use to communicate their messages. So, for example, Jarena Lee writes a spiritual autobiography. That is her being dutifully Methodist. It was not uncommon for women at that time, or men at that time, to write spiritual autobiographies. John Wesley encouraged people to write autobiographies, to tell the story of their faith journey, and to share that with others that they encountered. What was unique about Jarena Lee is that she, as a Black woman in America, was preaching in the slave state of Maryland, and she self-financed the publication of 2 versions of her spiritual autobiography. And she used her autobiography to challenge this perception that women could not preach. And she says, look, God has called me to preach. And her autobiography effectively serves as a compelling argument for, yes, don't doubt who God can call to preach. Lucretia Coffin-Mott is a person who is used to speaking in public. She's a Quaker minister. But what she does is mindful of the fact that not all women are speaking in public, and that's still kind of a new thing. When she rises to speak, she says, I am here at the urging of my friends. I'm not here to be aggressive or argumentative. I'm just here because friends have repeatedly urged me to come before you and mount this defense of women taking on a more active role in public life. Sarah Moore Grimke writes a letter. And again, personal correspondence, perfectly acceptable for women. What Sarah does is a little bit interesting. She takes her personal letter and she writes it to a woman who she knows is going to help disseminate her message. And she had to have known that people like William Lloyd Garrison were going to take her letters, the letters on the equality of the sexes, and reprint them in the Liberator and distribute them widely. And the last thing that I think women did that was really ingenious is what Frances Willard did with her strategic use of language. At the time of Frances Willard in the 1870s, 1880s, women had already gained some of the rights that they had been fighting for. And Frances Willard is also mindful that some of the leaders of the women's movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were radical, they were strident, and the numbers of the early women's movement were a little bit small because Southern women, conservative women, were a little bit put off by this talk of suffrage. And what Frances Willard did is she said, you know what? We are true women. And she embraced the cult of true womanhood. And she said, if you want to be better wives and mothers, what you need is home protection. And that was her word for suffrage. You need to protect your homes. You need the right to vote so that you can protect your homes. And by calling it home protection and couching it in these traditional values of women as wives and mothers, she was able to bring a huge mass of people into the fold of the suffrage movement. And anyone who studies social movements knows that if a social movement is to be successful, you need a large audience to mobilize. And that's what Frances Willard did. So these are just some of the things that we talk about in the book. And while it's tempting to say, oh, this is history, I think there are a number of lessons that the women teach us. One of the lessons that the women of the 19th century teach us is to honor the complexity of the women's movement. Speaking about women or the woman's movement as if it is comprised of people who share the same goals, the same values, the same experiences, really does not capture the diversity or the richness of the movement. Women were diverse because of their socioeconomic status, because of their geography, because of their religion, because of their race and ethnicity. And because of all of these diverse experiences, women were prioritizing issues, and sometimes they were prioritizing competing issues. How women were able to mobilize this diverse group of people around particular reforms is something that has been a major hurdle for women's movements throughout our history. And we have a lot to learn from our foremothers. They really can be instructive to us on the successes and why they had success and some of the mistakes that they made. A second lesson that I think that the women of the 19th century teach us surrounds this idea of civil discourse. I think it's an art that we've largely lost today. If you read, and I have, the letters between these women, it's riveting. And they are passionate, their remarks are biting, they are angry, and they are pushing back on one another. Because again, these women have different priorities, and sometimes there are competing priorities. And what the women do is push back so that they can refine their arguments and strengthen their arguments and become better advocates. But even as they are writing vehemently, with passion, with anger sometimes, these biting remarks, they are doing so with respect and with this idea that we are all in this and we are proceeding toward a goal that is going to make a better and brighter future for other people. And I think that art of civil discourse, of engaging in genuine debate and really truly understanding where other people are coming from, is something that we would benefit from today. And the last lesson that I think that the women of the 19th century teach us is a lesson about courage and perseverance and grit. These women fought for issues that they would never get to realize themselves. So women, for example, dedicated their entire lives to the quest for suffrage. Many of these women would never, ever be able to exercise the right to vote, much less even know that the 19th Amendment would be passed. But they had a vision, and they worked to achieve that vision. And so sometimes when I'm teaching this course that I teach for the Honors College on the rhetoric of the early women's movement, students become a little bit dismayed and frustrated, and they say, we are still debating today the same issues that women were debating 100, 150 years ago. Those women in the 19th century were advocating for reproductive rights, access to birth control and health care. They were advocating for fair wages and labor reforms. They were advocating for a seat at the table to make the policies and the legislation that would govern their lives. And the students say, what are we doing? We're still debating these issues. And again, while I think it's tempting to say, oh, look, we're still debating these issues, isn't that frustrating? I also find great hope in these women because of their fortitude, because of their courage, because of the successes that they did have. And in the end, I remind myself that because these 19th century women did what they did, our daughters can prophesy. So thank you so much. My name is Lisa Gring-Pemble, and the title of our book is Your Daughters Will Prophesy, Religion and Rhetoric in the 19th Century Women's Movement.